In 1993, Med Laboratories developed and released the first ever UVB lamp for reptiles. It's hard to think of a more important point in our hobby's history, and of course, Med Laboratories has been there since day one. We all know how crucial it is to provide proper lighting for your reptiles. Later on in this episode, we'll learn more about a Med product that will help you achieve your lighting-related goals. Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Today, I'm speaking with Phil Lietz, who is the owner of Arids Only, and of course the co-host of the Project Herpetoculture podcast, which is another podcast available on the Animals at Home network. I'm sure many of you are already aware of Phil. He's been on the podcast. I think this is his fourth time on the show. As normal with Phil, we just talk about what seems like everything, but in a way, this conversation was very much condensed to how we should feel about keeping reptiles in captivity. Quite often, and I am absolutely guilty of this, no pun intended, which you'll see in a second, is we approach reptile keeping from sort of a guilty standpoint about feeling, and I even talked about it all the time on the show about it. There is a sense of guilt of keeping these animals in boxes, for lack of a better word. And so this conversation is about how do we negotiate those feelings and how do we actually flip that on its head in order to make ourselves excited about what we do and realize that there is a positive effect, and it's not only good for us as the keeper, but good for the animals themselves. So I would say if I had to narrow down what we talked about within a sentence or two, that would be it. It is a conversation that revolves around ethics and philosophy, and for those who are really yearning for a deeper conversation about herpetoculture, I think you will really enjoy it. Let's just jump into it. I'll talk to you after the episode. Awesome. Well, Phil, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you very much for being here. I think this is number 3 for you, or maybe actually number 4, because we did one with Roy a few years ago as well.
Right. It's cool, man. I love these talks because I know we were just talking about before we started officially. It's like we have a tendency to talk maybe like once a year or so, and it's awesome. Like it's really cool because I really enjoy what you're doing with the show. I really enjoy having conversations with you specifically, and it's just a great time to talk about reptiles.
Yeah, I'm super excited for it, and obviously you've had a pretty massive change in your life over the last 2 months or so. I would love to know kind of maybe this is linked to reptiles as well. How is fatherhood treating you, and how's that experience been?
Yeah. It's at the risk of being as cliche as humanly possible, it's the coolest thing that's ever happened to me, ever. I never thought that I could love a person so much that I just met, and it's pretty hardcore. I think something that it's done that was a little unexpected is it kind of flattened out a lot of the peaks and valleys of emotion for me at the moment. Like obviously it's made like really good emotions and love and stuff just shoot through the roof, and that's great. But it's made other worries and stresses and other concerns in my life just feel like less sharp, because it's like, come on, man, at the end of the day, if that baby's happy and fat and doing his thing, that's at the end of the day, that's really the only thing that matters to me anymore, broadly speaking. And so it's pretty cool. It's really cool. And it's given me like a somewhat different relationship to like goals and ambition. I was actually just talking with my mom about this. Before he was born, goals and ambition felt kind of like self-referential and felt like, well, I'm doing this for myself and for personal achievement and personal gratification and fulfillment. And even though all of that's still there in some way, it's really changed it to where it's like, well, now I feel like I kind of have a responsibility to do more and to try to do better in the world and set better examples and just the whole nine with him. So it's awesome. And I'm sure you can relate, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I think that's a perfect way of saying it as well, as how it really does dampen some other worries. Like suddenly it just reframes things for you in a very strange way. So I'm curious, because one thing that happened with me, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, when my son was born, is because I have a small collection behind me. This is, the podcast is like my quote unquote business, but the animals are kind of just part of my hobby. I just enjoy them. I was very shocked at for lack of a better word, how little I cared about the animals in those first 2 weeks once the baby was born. I mean, I would come down here like once a day for 6 minutes to quickly check on things and then head back upstairs or change waters or whatever. But it was like the my perspective of how important the animals were shifted. Now, of course, they're very important to me. I love caring for them, but it was a bizarre thing. So I was very thankful, that I didn't have more animals than I had, because I was that would have been kind of scary, and also that they're not a big source of my income. So for you have a ton of animals, and it's a business for you on a much more real sense. So how did you manage that?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I very much relate to that feeling, there like the second he popped out, it was like, oh, nothing else mattered in those moments, like very, very, very much so. Thankfully, I had prepared quite a bit, and I have my employee at the shop, Brendan, who he's been on our podcast. Whoa, Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
cat. Sorry. Um, and he knew and was ready, and he took great care of everything while I was away. And I spent the first couple of weeks just at home with the family, and then right after that, I started popping over to the shop for an hour or two at a time, a couple hours maybe, just to kind of make sure stuff didn't go off the rails. It's also a little bit rough timing because it was like right before the big rush of hatchlings for the season. So things got a little crazy and hectic, but it was actually pretty perfect because I was able to take a paternity leave from my jujitsu academy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that allowed me to kind of ramp up the schedule. So to, really spend time with the baby, start to kind of get my mind around what it means to be a dad, and then be able to say, all right, well, okay, now how do I perform all my duties as a father and go make sure all the animals are okay? And then it was like, okay, now that I got that under control, how do I add the academy back in and all that other stuff? And then so only just now, so it's August 15th right now. Roy and I only just scheduled our first podcast back since him being born. So next week we're gonna record our first show and release it next Friday, since his birth. And so it was an interesting adjustment, but I guess we're pretty lucky because he hasn't been too terribly fussy. He's had his little moments. Hey, kitty. He's had his moments where he's had rough nights and stuff, but for the most part, we've been able to, between my wife and myself, and then my parents, my mom's helping us out. It's been a not as chaotic an adjustment as it could have been, given maybe more complicated circumstances or what have you. But you know, thankfully, I think it also helps that most of my animals are really, really tough, hardy desert lizards that, from certain perspectives, don't necessarily have a huge maintenance list.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I was working with something like chameleons of some variety, or tree monitors or something, I think it would be maybe a more complicated juggling act. But they're pretty happy. They're pretty happy for me not to be there poking them. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now,
yeah.
is there, maybe you could, for those who maybe never stumbled across you or your operation, you can kind of give us a sense of what you're working with and the size. But then I'm also curious, is now that you have a son and you have this great position at the martial arts gym as well, is your size of Arids Only going to expand or decrease or stay the same? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let me split this into two segments so that just for like a refresher recap, what have you, on what exactly I'm working with. The primary focus is Uromastyx, with a secondary focus on Xenogama, Taylorai, Chuckwallas, and then I have a few other extraneous projects. Like I have some butterfly agamas, and I have a couple of Egernia skinks, and I have some tortoises, like some hingeback tortoises and some Tunisian Greeks. And then I also have one San Esteban Island spiny-tailed iguana named Gregor Mendel, but he's just a buddy. So yeah, it is a business, and it's at a pretty decent scale. I have a separate facility, a flex warehouse space where I operate everything, right? And I occasionally post little snapshots of that space on my social media pages, and it's great. Now, as far as what the future looks like for Arids Only, um, you know what? Uh, I feel like I go through these cycles where sometimes I'll have like a what I feel like is a really clear idea of where I'm going. But most of the time, I think that the way I like to describe it is it'll feel like if I'm moving towards something, a rough outline of a goal, it tends to be a pretty blurry picture. And then what happens is like the closer I get to that goal, the clearer it becomes. I don't necessarily, I've never, with just a few exceptions in my life, like, you know, I know it's like, okay, I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like and I don't care what happens. I'm going to be a black belt one day. Like, I don't care what happens. I'm going to be a black belt one day. Right. With that single exception, I've never been the kind of person to set super clear goals. Like I'm going there. It's always been much more kind of fluid and responsive. And so with that in mind, I've reduced the total number of species that I work with, but I still have like the same base number of animals in the operation, if not a little bit more than I did a few years ago, like 2, 3 years ago. Um, and as far as like what the future looks like, I'm not sure, right? There are times when the right move seems like it might be going the reduction route and just having less. But more and more, I feel like I'm kind of trying to straddle what I see as two responsibilities. One of them being um, developing enough of an understanding of the species that I'm really dedicated to help get them, what we might call, quote, established in herpetoculture. And, we could talk a little bit about what the hell that means, because I think there's no real definition for that. But then additionally, I also feel a responsibility to drive more of what I'm doing towards kind of education, if you would. Maybe education isn't quite the right word, but it's more like consulting or uh, assistance, that kind of thing, where I try to spend a lot of time like putting out quality, helpful, useful information on my social media pages. That's become a bigger part of what I do. Trying to offer people advice and guidance in their goals. And just inevitably, I think producing stuff kind of ends up going hand in hand with that.
Mm.
And I feel like in the past, I think a lot of us in herpetoculture who have been around for a long time, we all remember you buy something from somebody and the second an animal is shipped to you, it's like you can't reach them anymore, like unless you're going to buy something again, they don't have the time for you. And something that I do and I put a lot of time into is answering questions, helping people, and specifically even helping people who have not purchased from me. So I say this to people all the time, like it just happened recently. Someone was choosing between me and a friend of mine, Nick Alexander, who's another Uromastyx breeder. And they were like, well, we might get an ornate from you, but we might get a Philby from Nick. And I was like, hey, great. Like, whichever you choose to do, I don't care. I will help you. If you have questions, I'm happy to help you. Right. And um, even though that can be tough sometimes, not the choice, not like trying to compete with people. That's not what I just mean when you have a following like I do, and it's not that crazy, but it's a substantial number of people. So I get a lot of questions via email and direct message and Facebook message, all that stuff. It can be challenging sometimes to answer so many questions and to specifically repeat the same answers over and over again. But I'm really committed to that conceptually, both in terms of the people who buy from me, because I kind of see like one of the things you're buying when you buy a captive bred animal as opposed to a wild caught one, like from a wholesaler or something, is you're buying the animal and like lifelong consultation, like lifelong care advice,
Mm.
which is one of the reasons I think you can justify like a slightly higher price tag is because, you're also going to, I'm going to help you a lot. It's going to take a lot of time. So, but I'm really committed to that because I feel like not only does that set a good example for the future, but it's also something that, really, like if you care about the well-being of the animals you produce, that's something that should be a given, from my perspective.
Totally.
And it doesn't mean I haven't, like I've had plenty of interactions where I've had to just stop talking to people, whether because they're rude or they're not listening to the care advice I'm giving, like you name it. Like that's happened a few times, but it's the rarity. Most of the time, people are pretty understanding. People are pretty appreciative of the help. Um, so I know there's a slightly long-winded way of saying it, but I kind of don't know
Mm.
exactly what the future looks like here. It might mean a little more. I've even had like weird. hoop dreams of like, well, maybe if I ever hit it big or like win the lotto or come into some money or something like that, maybe what I'll do is I'll like really build up the infrastructure of my space. And yeah, I'll still produce stuff because that's the one of the things that gives me a lot of joy. But I think one of the other things I'll do too is I'd like to really do um, more information. I just love to put out more of what I'm doing and more content for people to learn and consume and be able to potentially even in the future offer like small internships and stuff where
Mm.
people can come learn for a few weeks at a time at my place and something like this. Again, it's not super fleshed out, but it's sort of like what the blurry picture up ahead of me kind of looks like is something like that, if it
Yeah,
makes
yeah.
sense.
Yeah, well, that sounds pretty amazing. I mean, it's hard to replicate someone who has as much experience as you might have working with so many, like the volume of animals. Like, do you think that you have worked with more like individual Uromastyx, for example, than anybody else in the country?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Anybody else in the country, possibly more. I think the only people who might be able to up me on numbers are like the importer exporters, the ones who
Right.
see 10,000 come through in a season. I think the difference is that most of those animals, they're obviously not like in great situations, and they're not seeing them for an extended period of time. But in terms of like the number of generations, the number of animals that I see long term here year over year for the last 15 years, yeah, I think I would feel pretty confident in saying that I'm at least the top in the country in terms of numbers. Not necessarily the greatest keeper or anything. I mean, I think I'm really good at what I do, but I would never say that I'm like the best, you know, whatever in the
Yeah, yeah.
world or something like that. It's just not who I am as a person. But I do think that, yeah, without, kind of brushing up against that level of arrogance, like I'm a little comfortable creeping up to that line, but I don't want to jump in full throttle and be like, oh yeah, I'm the dude,
But you definitely have a volume of experience.
Yeah, and I think it changes to, for the Euros, like every single year, I feel like it's almost like compound interest, because it's not as if like, you can have people who breed one pair of Euros for 20 years, and that's great. But it's a different thing when you're breeding 20 pairs of Uromastyx every single year for 15 years across several species, and then you're 5 generations deep and all that. There's a lot. And so every single year when I produce a couple hundred, it's just like, whoa, like a lot more information comes up, a lot more problems will come up, right? Which is really important. And so I think this actually ties into what I was saying earlier about like what does it mean for something to be really established, right? So, you know, um, both the Uromastyx and the Xenogama, like I would actually feel pretty confident in saying it's possible, not 100% sure, but I'm pretty confident that I've also probably produced and seen more Xenogama Taylori than anybody in the country at this point, because I've produced hundreds of those things now, and we're now at probably the fifth this coming season, so 25, I'll produce fifth or sixth generation captive bred at my spot. So
Wow.
that's super cool, and I have a lot of them, and I'm growing that colony, and so there's like a level. And so the reason I bring up the established thing is because something that's really fascinated me a lot in herpetoculture lately has been this topic of stuff that we kind of take for granted. So whether this is like terminology or nomenclature or just concepts, so one that used to come up all the time is like, oh, this is a farm bred Uromastyx. Well, I understand that with certain species of frogs and certain iguana species, there are legitimate farms in their country of origin where stuff is produced for export to the rest of the world. With Uromastyx, I've never seen what I would call legitimate evidence of a quote farm where Uromastyx are bred en masse to export to the rest of the world. Everything I've seen has just looked like pens in their countries of origin where they're collected and then kept in that spot until they're ready to export,
Right.
right? And so, I've spent a lot of time kind of beating the drum against what people call farm bred, and that is what you're really getting is a wild caught animal. And let's
That
talk
spent
more
time
about
in a
that.
pen before it left.
Exactly. Yeah. And so another one is this idea of established. you know? So I feel like it's probably fair to say that the list of animals, of reptiles specifically, that are, quote, established in herpetoculture is very small.
Mhm.
You know, we're probably talking bearded dragons, leopard geckos, ball pythons, green iguanas, um,
Crested geckos.
crested geckos, blue-tongued skinks. So it's there's a number of them, but compared to the diversity of species that we have present in captivity, it's not, it's a tiny number, you know? And you know, there's some I'm sure I'm missing in there. And I guess what I would say is like there's no hard and fast definition of what it means for something to be established in herpetoculture. And there are so many animals for which if we lost one person, we might not have those anymore. You know, we got very close to that with stuff like Australian water dragons. You
Mhm.
know, Bert Langerwerf was producing those things by the hundreds every year for a long time. And when he passed away, they pretty much disappeared for a while. And yeah, sure, we had a few kind of trickle down and get to us now. And we have a few, you know, I know like Eddie Soto's working with them, and Ron St. Pierre and Heather Moy down there in Florida are working with them too. But it's like, there's this, it's like a small number. So I like the idea of something being established to the point where you could lose, you know, half the people working with them in herpetoculture, and you could still have those animals present and in a way that's sustainable going into the future, you know? And with the animals that I work with, they're not there at all. Like if I died tomorrow, some of the animals that I work with might legitimately straight up disappear, right? And
Right.
yeah, we might see them trickle in as imports, but who cares? Like if just because they're getting imported doesn't mean they're here and established, you know? So and it's pretty cool because the longer you go down the road of keeping stuff, not only do you just compound sort of like your numbers and the kind of experience you get, but you're also presented with new sets of challenges and things that you wouldn't have come up unless you kept those animals for 2 decades at a certain scale. And so you encounter both learning experiences and then challenges that um, really at the end of the day, I think are like a contribution in a lot of ways. They provide a lot of information and you know, you know, offer something that is really unique compared to, you know, 5,000 people across the country keep these things. Okay, that's cool and that's really great. I think there's lots of really interesting ways that, you know, people can engage in herpetoculture, but I just think that you know, there's some pretty unique ways you can do this, and I feel really lucky to be in a place where I can probably, I feel pretty confident saying there's not a lot of folks who have seen the kind of stuff I've seen with Euros, which is super cool. It's weird. It's
Yeah,
neat.
absolutely. Well,
Yeah,
and
neat.
I think too, like there's this when you do something for a long time and you're acquiring all this information, your brain will start logging things and recognizing patterns that you're not even really conscious of. So
Totally.
you probably are seeing things in your animals that you're subconsciously making decisions about, and you actually aren't even really aware of that you're doing it. Like this is how I am with swimming, because I've been around the sport for 2 decades. I have
Yeah.
quite a good eye for technique. And a couple weeks ago, I was working with a junior coach and helping her kind of spot things. And I'm like, yeah, it's interesting how challenging it is for me to like articulate this to you, because it's so innate to me. Like what I see is like I understand it right away. And so forcing yourself to go down more like an education path is probably so good for yourself, because you're suddenly having to observe what the hell you're doing on a daily basis that's making it work.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and you know, you find yourself encountering those challenges where you question, like, have I been doing this wrong the whole time?
Mhm.
You know, like is there going to be this one thing that I learn or that I get a handle on where I have to go, oh shit, like, whoops, I've got to rethink this thing I've been doing for 20 years. And that might be the case. You mentioned swimming. I often cite Brazilian jiu-jitsu and judo and wrestling. It's like uh practicing those sports have really given me a different kind of respect and regard for what things like inheritance means and stewardship and mentorship, because it's like, and actually also I'll credit Roy with a lot of that too. Like he was the one who kind of sparked my thinking about that stuff in the first place, and then
Mhm.
I had this allegory of martial arts to
Compare to, yeah.
overlay onto herpetoculture, right? Like I tell my students all the time, it's like we take for granted that we even practice this today. But your ability to do this is completely dependent on countless people, most of whom you will never know who they were, saying this is of value and I'm going to perpetuate this into the future. And that's how you inherited this technology, right? That is submission grappling. That's how you inherited this. And we're the beneficiaries of that in herpetoculture too. Like the only reason we're able to do this is because of a bunch of people who were like, this is valuable. This is worth it. I'm going to invest the time. I'm going to invest the money. I'm going to invest this, whatever the sacrifice may be. So that way more than just myself can do this. And as soon as that kind of plugged into my perspective, it was like, oh, I'm doing this for completely different reasons. It just changes almost instantaneously. Um, it's pretty weird. My hope is that if, surely there are plenty of other people who have thought about this much longer and harder than I have, but like my hope is that anyone else who feels that calling can, at some point have like open up their aperture enough to say like, oh wow, this is like actually a pretty important thing. This is a piece of cultural technology, this is like a cultural institution that I am contributing to, and I can have that contribution be positive or negative. And I don't think it's always one or the other. I think there's probably ways that we all contribute that's really positive, and sometimes there's going to be negative ways that we don't really understand, or maybe we're not fully aware of, especially not at first. Um, and so it's an interesting change in the way I view what I do, and then what we do broadly. And a lot of that's come from the show too, the Project Herpetoculture podcast. It's like, just continually asking every person that's on the show, like, why do we do this? Why herpetoculture? And it's, getting all these really unique, really intriguing answers. And I just feel like it's pretty cool. It's a fun responsibility, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll come back to that kind of later on, because I really do want to discuss more like the purpose behind keeping reptiles and whatnot as well. But let's get into, there's one topic, or at least two topics, that we definitely wanted to discuss today that were prompted by some content that I had put out earlier.
Yeah.
Do you want to set that one up? I mean, you had just posted a tile on your Instagram the other day that kind of was in reference to this.
Yeah. So again, a kind of recurring theme for me over the last, I don't know, couple of years has just been thinking a lot about stuff that we take for granted in herpetoculture. And again, that can be like verbiage and nomenclature, like established, or or whatever, or just concepts, right? And so one of those concepts there's been a few, but one of them has been the idea that breeding success isn't really indicative of like good care or well-being. And another would be, oh, you hear this tossed around all the time. Oh, well, our animals live way longer in captivity than they would in the wild. Other ones have been like, oh, you should only feed it food sizes that fits between the space of the eyes of the animal, and little stuff like this. And my experience is that most of those sayings are at best like a half truth, right? There's like a kernel of reality in there, but it's totally incomplete. So one of them, and the tile you're referring to specifically, is a post that this idea that breeding success doesn't really denote care, success, or well-being. And I think that that's totally not true. Like, and now again, it's not constant, right? So I put this in the post too, that it really depends, So you have something like a leopard gecko, a crested gecko, a bearded dragon. These things are really productive just in general, right? Or a banded gecko, like just a Coleonyx variegatus, the little banded geckos that run around here in the American Southwest. Dude, you can catch those things off of a road when you're night cruising. You put them in a little deli cup, and they will mate and lay eggs, not at the same time, but like they'll mate or lay eggs in the deli cup, And it's like a totally bizarre thing. Now, it doesn't mean that nothing will reproduce under poor conditions. Like, sure, sometimes it will, but like I think part of the problem with that phrase, that idea, is that it takes a very narrow perspective on what breeding success means, or like reproductive success. So you can have any of those animals where they reproduce once, twice, maybe a few times, but then you can look at their parameters and you can see that stuff isn't quite right, whether it's just in terms of care or general well-being, when they're just not right, but yet they're still producing animals. And the line of thinking here is that, well, these animals they're wired to breed, and they might just breed because they're bored or whatever, right? And which is like, okay, like fair enough. I can meet you there like halfway. But I don't have a narrow conception of what breeding success means. When I'm thinking about breeding success, I'm thinking of long-term, sustained, consistent, not just reproductive success and health of the parents, but long-term viability of those babies, their offspring, their offspring's offspring, so on and so forth. So it's like a real wide net that I'm trying to capture here, or like as wide as possible. Um,
Mm.
Even things like longevity, that's also not necessarily a great metric either, because you just look at people, right? You and I both have heard of people who take awful care of themselves. They do drugs all day long. They drink for their whole life. They smoke for their whole life. They womanize, they abuse, whatever, and they live to 105. And then you get the people
Mm.
who take phenomenal care of themselves. They eat clean, they exercise every single day, and they drop dead of something at 42. And it's like this is so they're just incomplete metrics. But you talk to anyone who works with any species for a long time, the only way you can get long-term, sustained, consistent, viable, and healthy reproductive success of the animals in question and their offspring and offspring's offspring and so on and so on is by way of very, very good care standards, you know?
Mm.
And uh, it was recently brought to my attention, and in a great way, like I think it's totally true that, oh, well, care and welfare are supposedly different things. So something can be under good care, but not necessarily good welfare. And therefore the original statement, breeding success does not denote good care welfare. That needs adjustment. Okay, okay, fair enough. I don't agree with that either because in my mind, I can't separate care and welfare. Like in order to be providing good care, you have to be providing good welfare, because then it's not care anymore, right? That's just maintenance. Like, so what?
Mm.
Like that's not that interesting. Um, if I think about any other animal that I'm keeping, whether it's a dog, a cat, like the two things are just completely synonymous with one another. They're intertwined in a way. You call them a Venn diagram, maybe, but it's pretty obvious that you could have aspects of welfare that you're providing without very good care, and you could have aspects of care that you're providing without necessarily great welfare. And so again, in my mind, you must put the two together, because if you don't, then there's ways that you're prizing the two apart when they want to be joined, right? Like I would never think of having a dog and not giving it good food, taking it on walks, playing with it, making sure my dog is having a good time and having fun, like actualizing itself and like just living a great life, you know? And so I can't. I'll also restate here. Yeah, you can point all kinds of to me. You can point out all kinds of examples where a bearded dragon or a leopard gecko or a crested gecko has reproduced under really suboptimal conditions. But like the majority of animals, you can't do that. I mean, if because otherwise we would just have animals breeding totally ad libitum, just producing out there and being like, oh my God, like we're just getting eggs and babies all the time. And that's not what's happening, right?
Mm.
Um, Breeding, we talk about animals exhibiting their natural behaviors as a marker of good health and good cognitive health. Well, that's a breeding's a natural behavior, like in order
Mm.
to achieve that, you've got to have some good metrics in place right at the front. Otherwise, you won't have it. And so I feel like this is a concept that gets bandied around that's just not fully complete. You know, does that sort of
Yes.
make sense?
I believe the Reptisun T8 was actually the very first UVB lamp I ever owned. I would not be surprised if you are the same. If you've been around in the hobby for a long time, you know that ZooMed Laboratories is an absolute mainstay when it comes to UVB lamps for reptiles. That's why the Reptisun T5 UVB lamp by ZooMed is one of the most important things you can have in your reptile room. These high quality lamps are produced in Germany and are used and recommended by zoos, veterinarians, and reptile professionals from across the world. UV light is crucial to allow your animal's body to synthesize its own vitamin D, which then allows it to use and metabolize the calcium that it ingests through its diet. That's why these lamps are used to prevent and reduce metabolic bone disease, which is a common disorder we see in reptiles that are not provided adequate light. The increased UVB output from these lamps makes them perfect for larger reptile habitats, and they have a slim, low-profile housing, which makes them sleek and professional looking. Again, that is the Reptisun T5 UVB lamp from ZooMed Laboratories. For more information on this or any other ZooMed product, make sure you head to zoomed.com or check out the link in the show notes or the YouTube description. Yeah. I totally know what you mean, and I think as far as like the care, or like we could call it like husbandry and care is like basically the same thing, and then the welfare piece. I think like the definition that Ellie had talked about on the podcast a few weeks ago was that like welfare would be defined as how the animal is coping
Yeah.
with the care that you provide. So they're obviously very linked, right?
Yeah.
Like the care and the husbandry is what you are giving to the animal as far as setup or whatever it else is, and then the welfare itself is like the ability for that animal to
Sure.
cope with that environment. I mean, you could think of yourself as a person. I mean, how are you coping with the environment around you, right? How you might have all the money you want, but all the things upstairs in your kitchen or your refrigerator that are going to make you great.
Yeah.
But if there are other things that are kind of preventing you from accessing that or whatever it is, so they're certainly linked. And I think I can see both sides to
Mhm.
the breeding piece, because you also had, and I think in many ways it's like a knee-jerk response to people that are saying, since this animal bred, that must mean I'm doing a perfect job of care.
Right.
So we were sort of seeing the knee-jerk reaction to the other side. So I think in order to have the discussion is sort of doing what you said, is the reproduction piece needs to go beyond a single clutch and a single
Yeah.
baby hatching or a one litter. It's this much more holistic, larger, the animal's fitness as far as their ability to pass down their genetics, but also their grandkids' ability to pass down their genetics and the health of the babies and the clutch size, the litter size, all these different things. It's not just a simple, these two animals were paired and they had a baby, that means
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
good.
Right. Exactly. And again, I just for added sake of clarification, I also understand and agree with the perspective, because people come to me all the time and say, well, I've been keeping my euro this way for 15 years and he's doing just fine. It's like, no, like there's some things you're missing here. So it's not that I disagree with the thrust of the concept. It's just that I'm really resistant to this desire that we have. And this isn't just in herpetoculture, right? This is like globally. Like we all want to reduce, this is like meme culture, right? We all want to reduce things to a concept that we can paste on a picture with a little bit of text and like deliver a message. It's interesting communication and it's not without its place. But I am so resistant to this idea that you can sum up uh, a really big and interesting concept in such a simplistic manner. I'm not, and I say in some ways, right? Because of course with like physics, right? The simplest formula is usually the best one, right? And that's Occam's razor.
Mhm.
Like I get that conceptually, but it's just not, I'm just resistant to the ones that sum it up that leave out so much other information. I mean, you mentioned like someone who's very wealthy, like it's someone who's millions of dollars, they've got everything they could ever want, but they're like miserable. That's not good. That's not, someone's not caring for themselves very well in that situation, right? Like that's this,
Mhm.
we all will expand our definition of success the second someone poses that question to us. It's like, well, if I'm really rich but I'm miserable, how successful am I? You know? Um, but also if you're like having a great family life and you're actualizing yourself as a person, it really doesn't really matter how much money you make. So I guess the point is it can kind of cut in both directions. It's like you could be caring for animals in a way that it's like really substandard, but you're getting lots of long-term reproductive success, but maybe they're not very happy. Also,
Mhm.
I've seen people who are giving their animals huge, vast enclosures, getting crazy kinds of enrichment and all kinds of, just really like living the billionaire's life of a reptile and herpetoculture, and they don't reproduce. That's a problem. Like that's also not right. That's something's not right there because if they're not willing to engage in this natural behavior that is so fundamental to what it means to be like a living creature on planet Earth. You've had billions of years of evolution pushing you to do this thing, and you're not going to do it. Well, that ought to be indicative of a problem as well. You know, um, you mentioned this concept, and I agree, again, I like Ellie's definition. I like that idea, and it comes from I know that there's a zookeeper who has a talk on YouTube who talks about this concept of cope. I find cope a really difficult term to really utilize here. And maybe I can illustrate it with another story.
Do you think it's too
Yeah,
negative?
yeah, very much so. Yeah, super negative. Yeah.
Okay.
So like um when I was coming up in high school and college, people would say, "Oh, we have to be tolerant of other people, tolerant of other cultures, tolerant of other lifestyles." I have a problem with that perspective, not because I don't agree with it, but because tolerance, you tolerate a baby who's screaming and beating the table because it's a baby. Like it doesn't know any better. It's like it's still learning how to live and figure out how to be in the world. I'm not tolerating someone else's existence and cultural development and familial history. I'm understanding and granting, um, like acknowledging their right to exist, not just tolerating them. That's very condescending. Like the verbiage to me is extremely condescending. And I kind of have a similar reaction to the idea of cope because and this would bring me to this other thing I wanted to talk about, which is like this
Hmm.
negative frame that we have towards what we do. Like everything is framed as a negative, right? There's this weird thrust in herpetoculture that kind of discusses what we do from a position of guilt and lack of confidence and like it's almost apologetic, like what we've done is just wrong somehow. And I get it, and again, I understand where that's coming from. I know where that's coming from in people because either A, we've seen other people mistreating animals in the same space as us, or we've been guilty of a certain kind of ignorance that has led us to mistreat an animal, accidentally, of course. Or we have um, this leftover frame of reference, which is like factory farming and all this stuff, which is pretty
Hmm.
horrific, right? So it's totally understandable to me where it comes from. I just kind of feel like it's just not the kind of terminology I want to have in this world going forward because it also kind of doesn't acknowledge what I see as like the basic framework for what we do, which is we're making a trade-off. Okay. So, okay, yes, we have an animal that was living in the wild and is now in herpetoculture. It's now indoors. Okay. Um, and I can understand, and it totally makes sense to me that if you're dealing with something like a tiger, you know, like that is going to be a really extreme trade-off. That's a net loss for the tiger. And
Hmm.
yes, obviously, we should do everything in our power to make the trade-off as equitable as possible. And so, from my frame of view, okay, you may not be in a position anymore where you were in the wild, where you kind of have like a base level of freedom and a base level of autonomy, but you're also so when you come into indoors, you don't have to worry about predators anymore. You don't ever have to worry about getting injured or getting sick because we're going to get you health care. You're never going to have to worry about your reproductive capacities if you're in a breeding situation, right? You're never going to have to worry about extreme weather or hunger or thirst, right? This is that whole the whole four freedoms thing. It's a trade-off. It's a trade. And yes, obviously I understand that the animal did not sign up for that trade. I get it. But I also think that none of us sign up for any of it. I didn't sign up to be born. The animal didn't sign up to be born into the wild either. It didn't ask for this. And
Hmm.
so it feels more like a trade-off to me, because even the four freedoms thing, they don't get freedom from thirst in the wild. They don't get freedom from hunger, freedom from stress, freedom from predation. It's not granted to them in that context either. So obviously, again, it's a trade. So when we bring something inside, we're saying I'm going to give you a set of things that you don't have to sweat anymore. But I also might have to make you hungry sometimes. I also might have to make you thirsty sometimes. I might have to make you run around sometimes because we know that even though the context is different, I'm not making you fight for your food. I'm not making you go find or hunt your food. I'm not making you wait for your food. We also know that it's very beneficial, like health wise, for me to make you a little hungry from time to time. You and I can fast,
Hmm.
and it's going to be good for us in a way, right? We can go exercise, and it's going to spike our cortisol, spike our blood pressure, make us freak out, our bodies in a state of fight or flight. But we also know that it's going to improve your long-term well-being. You're going to get stronger. You're going to have more muscle. You're going to just be better off long term. And and I also I'm a little wary, or not wary, but weary of like um the I try to acknowledge like all that we really don't understand, you know? And so I feel like both on it doesn't matter which position you take, there's probably positive and negative externalities to everything we do that won't be elucidated for 100 years. Like
Hmm.
I don't talk about a profoundly boring existence for an animal to just be constantly given what I mean, I'm not suggesting anybody's saying this, but like, constantly given everything it wants. It's never hungry, it's never thirsty, it's always in this perfect, like there is no such thing as like a perfect homeostasis constantly. That's just not how it works. You have to have peaks and valleys in order to have like a high level of engagement and well-being and intrigue in your life. And I just think that, if we're going to anthropomorphize and say that I want these animals to have a great existence, we also have to anthropomorphize and understand that there's going to be some stuff that's really good for them that they might not want. It's just like with kids. Kids,
Yes.
kids
Yeah.
don't want to brush their teeth or eat their vegetables. You gotta eat your damn vegetables and brush your teeth, bro. Like you have to. Um,
Yes. Well, and that's funny because I've actually made that argument before as well, because that's commonly, it's funny that you said that people don't actually make that argument. I do hear that on a lot of times on the ball python breeding side is the claim
yeah,
is it's like the perfect place for them. It's warm,
yeah,
it's got the hide, it's got the food. And I think that's a miss
yeah,
as far as I think the trade-off analogy is really good. And because I completely relate to we have this sort of negative kind of guilt associated with herpetoculture, and I feel that too. I mean, and it's hard to shed that, but I think reframing it as a trade-off sort of forces you to say, okay, we're going to do the best we can for these
right.
animals in our care, and sometimes it's going to be those type of stressors like you mentioned
Yeah.
that are actually valuable for that animal.
Yeah, for sure. Of course, and you should it's like we the negative frame is like this does two things, right? So number one, I think it's going to prevent other people from getting involved, because you're gonna hear people listen to these shows where people are like, well, we're doing this thing that's kind of shitty in the first place, so maybe we just do as good as we can. It's like, well, all right, I'm not gonna do that. That kind of sucks. I
Mm-hmm.
I come from a perspective that it is a fully natural thing to engage with the world in a way, and both physically in your environment to engage with animals. And I think it's completely normal, completely natural. And I think having a positive frame of mind is also going to lead you to do better things for your animals. But if you're just sitting there guilt tripping yourself all the time, that's like a horrible way to engage in a field in an industry. Like you gotta have like a hopeful, excited frame of reference. Like how cool is it going to be in 200 years when the level of base care for all of our animals is so high and like the mortality is so low and the well-being of each of those animals is so high. I mean, that's awesome. That's really, really cool. And those animals are going to benefit evolutionarily speaking. Like I've talked about this before, where I feel like it's a totally normal uh, evolutionary strategy for an animal to consciously or not attach itself to another animal for its own reproductive success, right? This is a concept from I think like Michael Pollan or a few other people who say that like, well, corn and soy and cows and
Yes.
chickens, yeah, they're like, yeah, maybe, yeah, sure, some of them are living rough, and that's a problem. We should fix that. But also, those animals are some of the most evolutionarily successful animals on the planet, you know, and that their existence is absolutely guaranteed into the future along with ours, right? As long as we're around, there's going to be corn, cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, all that stuff, cats, dogs. It's a very impressive adaptive strategy to make sure you're going to be you and your descendants will be there. And yeah, of course, we should make sure that all those things are super happy and living good lives. But like the wild doesn't offer that either, right? We all know we all of us can remember all of the stats about, you know, every clutch of sea turtles laid on the beach somewhere, like 99% of those damn turtles are going to die. They're either going to get
Yes.
eaten instantaneously when they hatch out of the egg, or they're going to die of starvation because they had some defect that we didn't know, or they can't make their way in the wild. They can't figure it out. There's some problem. They're not able to survive. They're not able to do their thing. It's like the wild, you know, I kind of have mixed feelings about this because even though I believe that the wild is a place where you know that's probably the best form of anything is the wild counterpart, like that's you know, but it's not as if that one animal is representative of every wild creature. You know, some of those animals die horrific painful deaths and like
Yeah.
really arduous stressful difficult existences, and I think it's cool that we're giving some of them an opportunity to avoid that. They're checkmating nature in some regard, being like, all right, forget it, I'm skipping right past all this bullshit. And yeah, that does not in any way, shape, or form excuse abuse or the the death toll of imports en masse. Like that is all absolutely a problem. I don't think it's an either or, you know.
Yeah.
I think we kind of have to have a world in which we acknowledge that the wild is also gnarly. You know, like it's gnarly. You ever watch Alone? You know, like
Yes. Yeah.
most of
Yeah.
those people, they're gonna die if you leave them out there long enough. They're just gonna die. And
That's right.
they're by themselves and they're not happy. And of course, that's not the way most wild animals are living. So it's not a perfect one to one. But I don't know. I feel like that stuff gets left out all the time. You know?
Yes. Well, and I think that's why, yeah, conceptualizing it as a trade off is really important, and because that's always the issue that I'll have with it as well. Like I'll go to an expo or something, and you'll talk to people, and you know, not anybody in
Sure.
specific, but you just hear people talking about animals, and sometimes you really get the vibe that it's not about the animal at all. It's more about this like
Yeah.
self invested interest,
Right.
and you're like, so you want to make sure you're straddling both worlds. That yes, we want to be respectful for the life that we're keeping in captivity, and
Yeah.
that we have these animals in captivity, and there is this trade off where yeah, they're not going to experience the great things in nature or in the wild. They're also obviously not also going to experience the horrible things in the wild.
Yeah.
But we're reducing the size of their home. We're doing other things. So in order to make it worth it for them,
Yeah.
there's things that we can do, whether it's increasing the care
Yeah.
or you know, there's a list of million things that we can do to make sure the trade off actually makes sense.
Totally. You know, so another point that's kind of in this vein is like, so I feel terrible because I can't remember the name of the zookeeper who had this talk on the online. It's on YouTube and it's about again about the difference between care and welfare, right? So I apologize for not being able to remember her name. Names are tricky for me. She makes one point in her talk about, well, you know, we also have to acknowledge like the relationship between keeper and kept, right? Which is great. I'm here for it. Like I fully sign on to the idea that the relationships that we have with our reptiles and amphibians can be a very positive one. It can be a super positive, beneficial relationship for both parties, right?
Mm.
And if we agree that our animals have the capacity for suffering, they also have the capacity for like enjoying themselves and having fun and interacting with someone. We see this in the wild all the time. People who have, oh, I've got this, we've seen, how many YouTube videos have you seen of like people who go out to the river or the pond and like hand feed some wild fish?
Yeah,
This
exactly.
fish
Yeah.
knows what's going on. Like it's like, hey, I like that guy. That dude gives me food. It's cool, right? So I won't put aside that interaction. I think it's a great thing. And so in the talk, she was talking about, well, we have to acknowledge this relationship. It's a good and a bad thing. And so one example of how this could be really negative is, let's say we get to a situation with an animal where it has to be euthanized for one reason or another. And maybe bringing in the keeper that animal has a relationship with, maybe that animal is going to smell your stress and know that you're stressed and upset about it having to be euthanized, and that's going to jack up the experience for the animal. Okay, like again, this is another thing where I can meet you halfway. But also, my dog or my cat, you try to tell me that I shouldn't be there for their end of life, I'm gonna fight you to get there. Like, good luck. I'm
Hmm.
gonna be there. Now, obviously, a domesticated dog is very different from a captive Uromastyx. Totally understand, different thing. But like, maybe it's not that different. I don't know. We don't really know. Like, maybe when my Euro has to get euthanized because it has some problem that's beyond me, beyond our veterinary care, maybe it would be nice for that animal to be around this person who he's had a relationship with for the last 20 years and has positive feelings around, even if I'm a little stressed. Like,
Hmm.
this concept of, and to be fair, I'm probably simplifying and generalizing this concept, and maybe I'm not doing justice to the person who gave this talk. That's not my intent at all. It's nothing but respect here, right? It's just, um, come on, like, if again, it's like, if we're going to acknowledge that those relationships can be positive, this whole idea that the only aim is to just reduce stress for the animal over and over and over. And I should also say that, like, okay, um, I'm going to venture into this, is like really not. It's probably a little like uncharted, and maybe not like this isn't very well thought out. So if everything I say from here on, from this point, is like really weird and nonsensical, like, my bad. This is how, for all of you listening out there, anybody who's paying attention to this, like, this is how I think through stuff. I verbalize thoughts. It's just the way my brain works. Okay. So, um, like, if it's really weird to me to see that so many of so much of the crowd of people that want to say it's all like, the only metric we should be measuring is like how, like, whether or not the animals are upset or stressed. It's like, man, are you doing this in your life? Are you existing in a way where you're reducing your stress and your experience of the world? This is kind of along the lines of like the idea that, the larger the enclosure, the better, constantly. It's always better to have a larger enclosure. Always, 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 always. It's like, well, I'm not very comfortable when I go into a mansion. I don't feel very good when I go into a huge house. It kind of makes me feel weird.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's probably cultural conceptions and weird thoughts that I have in my own mind about what it means to have wealth and live in a mansion. It's just a little kooky to me. But like, it's not a get in my from my perspective, it's not a given that more is always better. And how many resources are you contributing to your animal, but then not contributing to your own life or your own well-being or your family's well-being? Like, it again, if we are going to agree that this idea that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, is a true statement, like, by devoting my time to a business and a facility that has like 100 animals, what am I, what the resources that I'm giving to them and energy that I'm giving to them, what am I taking away from, like, time with my son or time with my cat or my dog or like my friends and my family and the people I'd rather spend all my time around constantly all the time. But it's a trade-off, because if all I did was spend 24/7 around my wife and my kid, they'd be pissed and they'd be like, dude, get out of here. Like, go earn some money, go do your thing. Like, get out of here for 3 hours. Like, we want to be away from you for a little bit, you know? So and maybe again, this is why I say this is probably getting a little bit obscure. I'm probably reaching a little bit. I'm probably getting out into the realm of just conception that's not really super accurate. But like, I don't know. I just feel like there's stuff there. I don't know. There's just there it just there's to me there's a mismatch between just committing so much time and effort and energy to these other things, these other creatures, which is great. You should. They deserve it. Also, you're a thing too. You also deserve some time to yourself and some go hit the gym for a while and like eat good food and like go on a vacation. And if you go on a vacation and your animal doesn't see you or the regular keeper for a couple of weeks, it's not going to kill the animal. It's okay. Like it's just 2 weeks without you is not the end of the world. I don't know. Maybe I'm probably going a little too far here.
No, no, I know what you mean. I mean, I think at the heart of this is there seems to be a lack of foundation for us to stand on to talk about keeping animals in captivity. It's and that's been the premise of this show from the beginning is like, how do we talk about keeping animals in captivity? What do we use as measures to make sure that this is the right thing to be doing? And I think you're so right. Like we're almost seeing a tilt in towards this. Like you said, it's a guilt.
Yeah.
It is a I don't know how to say this without making it sound like it's sort of human centric, but there's this like servitude that you must do to your animals and sort of sacrifice everything around you to make sure that the animal has this like pinnacle of care.
Bingo.
And while just sort of deteriorating everything else around you, and you become, this is not the right word to use, but I'm going to use it anyway, like a slave to the animal.
Yeah.
And of course, like my entire premise of this podcast is improving the welfare of the animals that we keep, but in some ways that if you go too far down that road, you get lost almost, and you don't, like you said, the enclosure continues to increase in size, and there's no way to have that. You can't philosophically have that conversation because there's no end point.
Yeah,
in
totally.
A way.
Yeah, no, I think that's bingo. Like really spot on, man. And it's complicated because of course, like we feel part of why we do this is like a certain kind of empathy for the animals that we with, right? You want them, like this stupid cat right now that's right on the screen. This little kitty. I want her to live the best life she can. I want her to be happy and hey, all right, you can chill on my shoulder. I want her to be like happy and actualized and like feel like a free agent over her own existence and stuff. But I've even been training myself for the last several months. I won't even say I'm trying not to say in captivity anymore. Because like speaking of verbiage and feeling how cope and tolerance have like a really weird negative connotation, so does captivity. Captivity's that's a horrific idea, right? And I've just been trying to say more like, oh, when we keep reptiles indoors, right? When we bring reptiles,
because you're conceptualizing a lot more like the way you keep a dog. Like you don't say I keep a dog in captivity. You say I keep a dog. It's my pet. This is what's part of. I share my home with this animal, and that is what most people do with reptiles. I mean, a ton of people that have reptiles have one or two, and they treat them like cats and dogs. They let them out. They play with them. They would sit on the couch with them. And it's not this captive. Like I obviously understand the concept of captivity and why we use that phrase, and that and some people may be seeing this as more nitpicking the terms, but it does bring in this negative thing, and if you treat it more like I keep my dog, he's part of my household. That's a different way of phrasing it and thinking about it.
Yeah, they're my companion. This cat is a companion. And again, you say, oh well, this could be conceived as like nitpicking the terms. Yeah, a little bit, but I also think that the words we use are really really matter. Because if it's like if we're talking about agency and choice, well, that's really limited for all of us, right? I don't have complete free agency over every choice I make in the world because I have to consider laws, socio-cultural norms. I have to consider what my son wants, what my wife wants, what my cat wants, what my dog wants, my coworkers, my friends, the person I'm standing in front of in the line to get coffee. Like I can't just decide, I actually prefer to punch people in the head. Like I can't, there's stuff I can't do. I'm not a free agent in an absolute sense. And I also happily make these cats keep backing me up. I happily make these trade-offs, and some of them I also don't have a choice. I don't have a choice that I live in a country where I have to work a 9 to 5 just to live and survive. Like, boy,
Yes. Yeah.
wouldn't it be just better for my welfare if I could just, live a subsistence hunter-gatherer lifestyle, an immediate return hunter-gatherer lifestyle? Yeah, I think that'd be great. But it's also not in the cards, right? And if we're operating,
Well, and the trade-off part
yeah,
too,
it's a
like all the,
trade-off,
the,
right?
the benefits of living in this 21st century. You have all these things that you get to
Yeah,
do. Like jujitsu is one of them,
yeah,
right? Like you said, this is this technology that you get to exist
yeah. And
with.
if
That's not going to happen in a hunter-gatherer
Right. And if
situation.
I break my leg or I'm not break my leg, if I get a staph infection, I can go get antibiotics, man. Like you're not going to have that option in a subsistence hunter-gatherer immediate return lifestyle, right? It's
Hmm.
if we're already operating, excuse me, from the premise that my participation in this world doesn't change whether or not herpetoculture exists, right? Like it's going to be here even if 50% of us dropped out of the industry altogether. It will be here. It's a part of the world, right? So therefore we're already acknowledging that there's this present uh, state that there's a certain number and certain diversity of animals of all kinds that we are bringing into our homes and existing with on a specific level. Well, okay, I'm just going to take that as a given and say that level of agency is gone. It's out the door. So of course, and again, none of this. It's not mutually exclusive. It's not like it's not either or. It's and both. Like we can have a world in which we're discussing the improvement and well-being, the improvement in well-being of the stuff that we keep and work with, making sure that both keeper and kept are existing in a world that allows them the most agency, the most choice over their life, and being able to feel actualized and fulfilled and living these great lives. And we can also acknowledge that like sometimes if choice isn't present, that's not necessarily the end of the world. It doesn't mean that everything's going to fall apart. And again, if the stated goal is to say we exist in this world anyway, and therefore we need to make big improvements, which I agree with, then it's probably for the better that we really get choosy about our verbiage and our the position from which we're discussing the topic, because you're gonna catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. So if I want to try to convince people that keeping snakes in boxes is not necessarily good and could be construed as cruel in one way or another, well, okay, maybe the better way to do this is to come from a place of like, hey man, I'm not just gonna, if the conversation starts with, damn idiot, like I can't believe you're doing this. What a piece of shit you are. It's like, well, good luck. That person just turned off their entire brain to you. You're not getting through to
Mm.
that person anymore. So if you want, I like the idea of, there's lots of different ways to do this. There are ways that I'm going to agree with more and I'm going to perpetuate more. And then if there's another person over here who's not doing the things the way that I like it, or the way that if I think this person's doing it wrong, well, we can have a conversation about that. But you're not going to stop people from having dogs just because they don't care for their dog the same way that you do. You and I both have seen, let's take a golden retriever. There's one kind of golden retriever that's like a fat slob that never goes on walks, that gets fed constantly, that, that dog still looks pretty happy. Even though it's not that great, it's probably not good. There's lots of people. Let's not even go as far as dogs. Let's just go people. I mean, you and I can think of countless people in our lives that don't live a lifestyle that we think is great. It's not good for you. You probably shouldn't smoke
Hmm.
cigarettes. It's like, I'm not going
Yeah.
to tell you you can't do it, and again, I know that this is also incomplete because the point is that you can choose to smoke cigarettes and that your dog can't, right? So I think this is like a fair
Most
Yeah, most
dogs.
dogs. Some dogs are pretty cool. Like I bet there's a Belgian Malinois out there that enjoys a nice Marlboro every once in a while.
For sure.
But you know, it's just none of what I'm saying is intended um to stop anything. Like I'm not trying to get people to stop doing what they're doing, or and I'm not trying to say that like, well, this person's wrong or that person's wrong. I just really like the idea of having uh a much more nuanced and open-minded perspective rather than like a definitive, this is the way it is, and if you're not on board with me, you're an asshole. Like I just can't
Mm.
I can't do that, man. There's so many areas in life where that's the case. Politics, bro. You don't vote my way,
Yeah,
you're a
exactly.
son of a bitch. It's like, come on, dude, get out of here. Like, and I don't believe in like the malicious intent. I think that most people who do this, like most people who keep reptiles, I really do believe that most of them like really do think that they're acting in the best interest of their animals. Like they really do, you know? And even I just think that sometimes it's really hard to hear when you might not be. It's really, really hard. And so we should try to take a little care, have a little bit of compassion for the people that you literally are working with. Like you know, you're in herpetoculture, and so is uh what's the dude with all the retics? The cat NARD reptile. What's yeah,
Kevin
yeah.
McCurley. Yeah.
I don't agree with the way he does things. He's still in herpetoculture. We're in herpetoculture together. Like I may not agree with him, but I also don't think that he's sitting there as like some malicious asshole who just doesn't care about his animals. That's not the way I think of that guy, you know. And admittedly, I don't know Kevin. I've never talked to him. You know, I got nothing. No, I have zero perspective on that. I'm just, you know, trying to be diplomatic here. You know,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
way to talk with someone that you don't agree with is not to tear them down and tell them how they're being an asshole and a horrible person. It's like, let's talk about this because if we have a conversation about it, you're probably going to get through to them a little more, you know?
Yeah. It's sort of approaching the situation from good faith, and I've talked about this, maybe even with you before. There's you would be able to relate to this. Is when I was a competitor myself, I used to like train myself to like hate the people I raced
Yeah.
against, and then I realized like as I matured as an athlete, I realized they're actually great people. You have a lot in common because you do the same sport, and then they're your friends, you know. And then it's a lot more fun racing against them because now you're your buddy, and yeah, sometimes you win, sometimes they win, and but there's this kind of like othering thing that that your mind will do initially, but then you realize you're all part of the same bubble, and I think that's kind of the point that you're making, and I think we do, at least a lot of people who are more on the like, I don't even like this term, but I'll say it anyway, the advancing side of herpetoculture do come from that guilt side. Yeah. And like here's a classic example. I have a comment that I got yesterday on a video. And this is sort of the stuff that we end up like this comment all in all caps: poor animals in jail, free them. And actually, it was an image of animals that are at a zoo, which is kind of ironic anyway. Yeah. But that's the sort of, it's tough when there's a whole sector of society that does that to us. But I think as reptile keepers, another rule of thumb that I like to live by is don't apologize for something that you've not done.
Yeah.
And it's like, are you yourself abusing animals, or are you actually doing the best to provide everything you can for them, making sure that you're increasing their welfare, the enrichment that they have? Are you working towards making their lives better? If you are, you actually don't have to answer that guy with all caps.
Right.
Because he's not part of the conversation. And I think we have a tendency to just immediately try to build a defense against them and say like, no, like I'm so sorry for doing this. And it is hard. I definitely swing between both worlds because you can't help but feel a little bit guilty. But I think what you're saying is they are in our care. It's like, I like the indoors thing rather than the captivity. I think that sort of defines it perfectly. Yeah. Like there's this relationship that you have with your animal that's positive, and yes, we want to improve their care. That's what we're doing, but we don't have to start from the weakness of being guilty for doing this, like we've done something bad.
Yeah, and absolutely, I agree with all of that. And if you're doing your best and you're doing so much for the animals that you're keeping, why be guilty? Like you're doing a great job. And I'm sure the animals are benefiting as a result, you know? And I've also been, I haven't made it a big secret. There's some stuff that I feel like it's not a fair trade-off, right? Whether like the tiger example earlier, I feel like things like croc monitors and retics and black throat monitors and anacondas. Okay, now we're talking about like you really have to be going above and beyond to make the trade-off worth it for an animal like that. You know what I'm saying? Like now we're really
Yes.
talking pretty hardcore. But if we're talking like a Xenogama taylori, the lizard's this big, man. Like it is not that hard, I think, to give that animal a very high standard of living. And some of this, so again, some of this is a matter of scale, but so is everything, right? Like
Yes.
there's
Yeah.
it's a sliding scale, and there's going to reach a point where it's like, well, it seems conceivable to me that you get up to a certain point and it becomes a more cognitively, financially, all of the resources that go into making a fair trade-off get much, much steeper, you know?
Yeah.
And that's okay. So like if I see someone keeping a berm in a massive enclosure and interacting with that animal on the regular and taking them to the vet regularly and making sure they're getting all the things they need and like really going above and beyond to vary their food and give them a great life. Go nuts, man. More power to you. That's great. It doesn't mean it's not possible. It's just really hard, you know?
Yeah.
Another example would be like an orca whale. You know, I'd make the argument that it's probably the case that an orca not going to happen. There is no
No.
the ocean is the place for that that animal, right? But like a what's the little sculpin fish, like a little, you know, the little guys. Okay, now I could maybe not an ocean probably isn't necessary for that, right? Like it's now we can say, well, we could probably reasonably house a clownfish indoors and in a way that's really good for the animal and it's like a fair trade-off now, you know. It's not
Yes.
gonna be
Yeah.
for everything, you know, but
Yeah, and I mean, you're so right. Like last weekend, we took my son to the zoo, and we have a pretty interesting zoo here in Manitoba and Winnipeg. There's some really cool, like Churchill exhibit, which is a city far north with polar bears and wolves
yeah,
and whatnot, and they have this really huge thing where the polar bears can swim and everything, and that's amazing, and it's kind of world renowned for that. And then you'll walk past some exhibits that are like birds, and you go, okay, there's like a sandhill crane I saw, which is they're native to here. They're quite a large bird, and they fly thousands of miles. And and it's in an enclosure that it actually cannot fly even. And you think, okay, that's a steep
yeah,
trade off.
yeah,
Like as even if it's a cool looking enclosure, that's an animal that with a flap of its wings gets across the entire
yeah,
thing. Now we're getting into territory that is probably not the best. But the polar bears have these like tons of acres, tons of space, ability to
yeah,
swim. That makes sense to
yeah,
me.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's
Dude,
for sure you have to analyze it from that
I
point of view.
love that. Yeah, I completely agree with that, you know, and because that also illustrates how we have a tendency, like there's some folks who would say, well, you keep any animal, you keep animals in jail, a zoo is jail. It's like, well, I've been to some zoos with some pretty goddamn impressive. They're
Hmm.
devoting crazy resources to those animals, but then in the same zoo, you can see them devoting a little less to another animal where you're like, maybe you can keep going with the polar bears, but how about you let this crane go? You know? Like,
Yeah,
and I think
exactly,
that's totally
exactly.
fair. It's like you can have two things can be true, you know? Like it is, it doesn't have to be one or the other. Both things can exist at the same time. We can have great examples of great care and great resources. But I also think it's even weirder, like, oh man, like and this gets into even more weird and ethically fraught conversation, which is like it's weird that we can have like a zoo where their polar bears, their rhino, their elephant their giraffe get so many resources, like so much resource. And then right down the road, less than a mile away, there's a couple of people that are living horrific homeless existences, right? Like
Yes,
that's
yeah.
really weird, you know?
You could drive past them to go see the
Exact.
giraffe.
Yeah, totally. That's a very bizarre existence. But then it's like then now we're talking about like a totally different kind of in-group out-group kind of thing, right? Because now it's like, well, I also don't agree that like a giraffe is worth more than a person or vice versa. I don't think that it's not like a value judgment. Like the giraffe isn't more valuable than the person and the person's not more valuable than the giraffe. Then it's like really complicated. But I think that's the kind of question we're having to ask ourselves all the time when we in herpetoculture. It's like, well, how valuable is this? Like what kind of value are we going to put on this animal? And so often the ones that are priced cheaply or really easy to come by, we don't value them the same way as we value something like an earless monitor, a Borneo earless monitor, where it's like there's only like 50 of those here in the country. Like that's a crazy valuable animal. It's like, well, it's not just scarcity. Just because there's fewer of them doesn't mean that leopard gecko doesn't deserve the same kind of care. You know,
Hmm.
it's a really peculiar way to go through the world. And I think, but then we're always using comparisons with other industries. It's like, well, I just read this really weird book called the Light Eaters, and it's about plants. Dude, that book will give you a completely revamped perspective on what it means to be a conscious being in the world. And so it's like we'll put all this value, and I wouldn't necessarily argue anymore that like a reptile is more conscious than a plant. I don't agree with that statement anymore, at least not in the same way. And so, but yet at the same time, dude, botanic gardens, uh, nurseries, thousands of these beings that are like pretty conscious, like in all the ways that you might think of consciousness, those plants are having an experience of the world. There's something that it's like to be that plant. And there's
Hmm.
all these relationships and things that we just don't know about. And, we just don't give it the same credence because it doesn't look at us. It doesn't have eyes. It doesn't have a nose. And so we think, oh, this is a different thing. This is a different creature altogether. It's like, yeah, it's different, but it's still having an experience. And yet, you know, we jack around with plants in way bigger ways than we do with our reptiles, and and I'm not saying that horticulture is like a big evil thing.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. Sometimes I just think it's helpful to have a slightly different perspective, stuff that maybe just tries to kind of rattle the gate of what we think of when we're working with reptiles and amphibians.
Yeah, no, I totally know what you mean because it is a complex thing. There is some complexity to keeping animals in captivity and keeping them in your home, and yeah, more so than the domesticated dog and
Yeah.
cat, which has been around for so long. So I don't even. I'm just already thinking in my head, what am I going to title this episode? We've talked
I
about
don't
so
know.
much.
I also want to say one more thing about just about that too, because
Please, please.
like dogs, cats, guinea pigs, chickens, pigs, all this stuff. Um, Part of the reason that I think they're useful comparison examples is not because they're the same thing. They're clearly not, right? Like this cat here is a very different animal, but it didn't start that way. Like there was a point at which it was just a bunch of Neanderthals like sniping the puppies from a wolf litter. You, it's just like, give
Yes.
me that.
Yeah.
I'm going to use this for hunting. And so we don't we take it for granted because it's been around for millennia. And we've reached a point where we know that when we make eye contact with our dog, that I get a dopamine or serotonin release and the dog gets a serotonin release. Your horse gets a serotonin release when you look at it. When I point, my dog knows that I'm giving it it's like language. I'm using visual language with my dog. Okay, yeah. My Uromastyx don't have that same thing. They're not, when they look at me, they're not getting a serotonin spike, I think. Maybe they are, I don't know, but I don't think so. But the point is like it's got to start somewhere, And I think that it's I don't have it constructed, but someone could conceivably construct a philosophical argument that says there's downstream value to developing intimate domestic relationships with lots of different animals. And
Hmm.
and um it may be uh really obscure at the moment, and it might be really undefined and not very clear, kind of opaque right now. But I think that it's one of those things that, will probably have a lot more well defined values and ideas about why this is worth it in 100 years.
Well, there is, I think, an argument, and some people won't like this argument, but I think there is probably an argument to say there is a bizarre amount of motivation for us to do
Yeah.
this is coming from like an innate
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
place. So if you don't even question that, you just say like, there's something that's drawing us to do this. You could actually potentially use that as a cue for its importance.
Yeah.
Now, I think some people will say, well, some people want to be serial killers and they have a strong pull to do that. Well, yeah, you can find examples, but there's something about humans working with animals that has been persistent for the entirety of time. And yeah, we might not fully understand it right now, and maybe there isn't a bigger picture with the herpetoculture in general. But I think typically you don't do things and spend money and waste energy on things that have no purpose.
Yeah, yeah.
And if we can't define it, well, everybody can define their own purpose individually, like you guys do in your show. Everybody has their own purpose, but is there a purpose with a capital P of herpetoculture that we're not fully aware of? I think that there
I
could
think
be.
so too, because you say, well, there are people who are driven to murder others, right? But it's not pervasive. It's not like the desire to keep pets is like pretty much everybody, like almost everybody does that, like
There's no Facebook groups of murderers.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
We have a lot a lot of people that
There's no
do
Project Murder,
Yeah. Yeah.
right, for sure. So
Exactly.
it's like I think the fact that it's pervasive across cultures, it's really pervasive among individuals. Like I think what is it, like one in every two people has a pet, something like
Right.
this. It's something crazy. I don't think that's an accident. I don't think that's like some weird cultural artifact. I think that's built into us in some way. It's like, and again, just like you said, I don't know if it's super clear yet, but I really think there's something there. And even if it's just to, I've always loved Philippe de Vaugelis' idea that it's like a recognition of another kind of consciousness. I love that too. I think it's great. But I think it's also about like it's about there's like a real uh there is a it's like communion with the world in some way, the same
Yes.
reason you want to go out into nature. It's the same reason you want to run. It's the same reason you go to a haunted house. It's the same reason you sit down to a good meal with friends. It's like there's something about the act of engaging with another life form that's not just for me. It has larger implications and more meaning than and especially in a world where like so much of the world is just being wrecked around us. So there's so much shit
Yes.
going on. It's like I don't think it's all that big of a deal to make that trade-off with a certain number of animals.
Well, and just hearing you talk about that, yeah, it is so deep, and it does go cross culturally because you define a culture by the basic things like how they eat, the language they use, the music and whatnot. Like if you were to take an Asian culture, which is very different from a North American culture as far as language, food, music, movies,
Yeah.
entertainment. They keep reptiles the same way we keep
Yeah.
reptiles. We keep reptiles. It's very weird when you think about a culture that's very, very different. Even the way, like their cultural norms, the way they interact with each other in public is so different. Yet, like one thing we do very similar is like we keep
Yeah.
snakes, which is pretty
Yeah,
strange.
dude, it's so weird. And it's also like even hunter-gatherer groups keep pets, you know. Like
Yeah.
it's all kinds of and it's for all different ways, all different reasons. Like what is that? I swear I've seen a picture of and again, not that I can extrapolate from a single photograph, that would be highly intellectually not good, but I know I've seen that there's a picture that's gone around from time to time of some indigenous woman somewhere like breastfeeding a pig with her baby. And
Yes.
it's,
Yeah. 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 I
well,
think that was. I think maybe Paul Rosalie share that?
I'm
Maybe I
sure. I
forget.
feel like I've seen it in a lot
Yeah.
of different places and across a long
Yeah.
span of time. And it's like there's so much you could say from something like that, whether it's caring and empathy, mutual exchange, both parties are getting something out of that for some reason. Like what a wild thing. And again, I'm not trying to say that it's there's something altruistic about herpetoculture necessarily. Maybe there is, but I don't know. But it's just, the point is just to say that it's like, this is really deep in us, and it's not for nothing. And therefore we should have a positive outlook on it, because it's a really, really cool thing. Other animals keep pets, man. Like what
Hmm.
is it? Like ants that farm other insects for their food. I mean, this is not, it's not just us, right? It's just same thing with grappling and submission grappling. Like, it's not just people. Lizards grapple, you know, they
Yeah,
wrestle.
e-
You know, it's
exactly.
like, come on. Like, it is so badass. It is such a cool thing that this is a thing that we do, that we can do, that we live in a world where this is like condoned, and that we have the freedom to do this. It's wild. And it is probably even more incumbent upon us to do the best we can possibly do, which is why it's good that we have people who think differently than me, and think people that have different perspectives on this. Is a good thing. It's a really good thing,
Hmm.
you know? So
Yes.
it's awesome. I think it's great. And so I don't want to be guilty or self-conscious about this. I don't want to come from a place of apology. I want to be like, yeah, yeah, of course. This is awesome. This is super cool.
Yes.
How great.
And I think to kind of tie that up is starting from a position of it's cool, this is great, this is like fundamentally good for both
Yeah,
parties is a much faster path to actually continue to expand how good it
that's right.
is.
I totally
Rather
agree.
than starting with this like rapacious negative guilt thing that we quite often fall into. Like it's really hard to like dig yourself, like you're starting at -10 rather than starting at 0 or 2 and just building off of that.
Yeah,
Like the more excited we are and the more happy we are that the animal is achieving a high state of welfare, the faster we are going to continue to push the limits of
yeah,
that than starting, depressed.
absolutely. Yeah, dude. Couldn't have said it better. That was a great, nice.
Well, Phil, we talked about a lot here. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up? I feel like we covered a lot of. I don't even know if I have a couple bullet points here of other things, but we talked about what we talked about today was perfect because I think that a lot of people think about this all the
Yeah.
time, and it's just giving people tools to think about it. I think is really great. But yeah, is there anything you wanted to mention before we
I
wrap
don't
up?
think so. I think that's pretty good. I think if you're looking for a title, just put title like "What the hell."
What the
Yeah,
hell
what
are
are
we
we even
doing?
doing? This is nonsense. Yeah, because it definitely not what I anticipated, where I anticipated the conversation going, but it feels really good. I feel like this was a fun chat, and it's the one of the
It
cool things
really
that I love
was.
about coming on the show and talking with you, man, is because we always go into some interesting places, and I think it's beneficial. At least it's beneficial for me anyway. I think this is great.
Yeah, yeah, same with me. Having these conversations allows you to develop new thoughts, which I think is so crucial. Can you just let everybody know where they can find you and, of course, the podcast,
Sure.
please, as well?
Yeah, so let's start with the podcast, the Project Herpetoculture podcast. It's on the Animals at Home Network, and on anywhere you get your podcasts. And then my pages it's Arids Only, and that's on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. My wife started a TikTok for me, but I don't know. I don't do anything with it, so I don't know what the hell is going on over there. But I just videos. So yeah, you can find me in all those places. If you reach out to me, I try to respond to people, and I hope it's not always, I don't always engage like perfectly with everybody, because I can't. I just don't have I literally can't. I have to set boundaries, otherwise I won't ever see my wife or my son. So but if people have questions or want to ask me about something, or even better, if you want to challenge anything that I said here, please do it. I would love to hear a counter argument or a perspective that's different from mine. I mean, that's one of my favorite things about doing this, about doing our podcast, is that we get, I get people who think differently than me. And it's like, usually that's an opportunity for me to be like, oh shit, never thought of it that way. Maybe I'm gonna have to change the way I think about it. So hell yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Well, Phil, it's always a pleasure. So thank you very much. And we'll have to do another one next year.
Anytime, bro. Anytime you want.
All right. That is the end of that episode. Phil, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast again. I really enjoyed that conversation. Listeners, I hope you did as well. I know this is a tough conversation to have. It's very tough to just follow bullet points and discuss the ethics and the philosophy of keeping animals in your home. And I hope that we did a good job of kind of meandering around that point and making some salient points. Like like I said through the intro, I commonly find myself more on the guilty side. And I think it's important to realize, like, hey, actually, personally, I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job with my animals. They have large enclosures with good enrichment and their welfare is quite high. Doesn't mean that I'm done and doesn't mean that I'm not going to continue to learn. It's just starting from that extreme guilt can make it very difficult to have pride in the work that you do. And I think in order to have herpetoculture progress and be better, being proud of what we do is really important. So hopefully you felt the same way and you got something out of that conversation. And please add to the discussion if you would like. You can find the podcast obviously on YouTube if you're watching it right now, but also on Spotify or Apple. You can leave comments on YouTube, but also Spotify as well. You can find these show notes at animalsathomenetwork.com. Of course, there you can find the other podcasts that are on the network, including Project Herpetoculture, which is the podcast Phil hosts with Roy. Thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring the podcast. You can find an affiliate link in both the YouTube description and the show notes. If you'd like to join us over on Patreon, I would be very grateful if you did. You can do that at patreon.com/animalsathome. All of the money there essentially goes to editing the show, which really is a load off for me. Again, I say it all the time. If I didn't have an editor for the podcast, which is Liam Sinclair from the Reptiles Research Podcast, the podcast would not happen. I'm not able to organize my life in a way to carve out 5 or 6 hours to edit each episode. So if you are a Patreon member, you are directly responsible for the show existing. So thank you so much. And I think that is the end of this one, everybody. I will catch you in the next episode.